There is a specific kind of silence that fills a boardroom right before a catastrophe. I was sitting across from Caspian, the new VP, as he slid my termination papers across the mahogany table. He smirked, telling me my safety protocols were wasteful and that firing me would save the company $2 million a year. He was wrong. By firing me, he didn't save money. He pulled the pin on a $50 million grenade. 3 days later, his entire inventory was rotting in the rain because the robots I programmed refused to open the doors for him. Before I tell you how my termination letter became his arrest warrant, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had a boss who thought they knew better than the expert, hit that subscribe button. You're going to love this collapse. I am Veda, 48 years old, and for the last 10 years, I have served as the chief systems architect for the Nexus. I do not dye the gray streaks in my hair, because each one represents a critical system failure I averted at 3 in the morning while the rest of the world was asleep. To the investors, the Nexus is just a line item on a spreadsheet, but to me, it is a living organism, 50,000 square feet of automated logistics, a cathedral of steel and silicon, where robotic arms move with a synchronization that borders on art. I wrote the code that governs their heartbeat. I know the friction coefficient of every conveyor belt down to the 4th decimal point. But on this gray Tuesday morning, sitting in the executive boardroom that was kept at a sterile 68 degrees, my decade of flawless service was being dismantled by a man who didn't know the difference between a server rack and a toaster. Across from me sat Caspian, the newly appointed vice president of restructuring, a man who wore his ambition like a second skin, tailored, expensive, and suffocating. He refused to make eye contact with me, fixating instead on the quarterly expense report lying between us as if it were a holy scripture I had desecrated. His manicured finger, tapping rhythmically and annoyingly on the paper, had circled a specific figure in angry, bleeding red ink: the annual maintenance budget for the robotic calibration sensors. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was pressurized, the heavy, static-charged silence that fills the air right before a structural beam snaps under too much weight. Outside the glass walls, I could see the blurry shapes of the office staff moving back and forth, oblivious to the fact that the person who kept their digital world spinning was about to be ejected from orbit. When Caspian finally spoke, his voice was smooth, devoid of any friction or empathy. The voice of a man who believed that human beings were just another variable to be optimized. He didn't ask me why the budget was high. He didn't ask for the engineering rationale behind the costs. He simply stated, with the casual boredom of someone ordering a sandwich, that my obsession with precision was a luxury the company could no longer afford. He leaned back in his leather chair, a chair that cost more than my lead shift supervisor earned in 3 months, and sighed. It was a theatrical performance. A sigh designed to make me feel small, to frame my rigorous engineering principles as petty, old-fashioned inconveniences. He looked at me with a pitying smile and told me that the 15% buffer I insisted on for hardware synchronization was fat. He used that specific word, fat, as if the safety margins keeping multi-ton robotic arms from tearing themselves apart were nothing more than unnecessary corporate cholesterol. I did not need to be standing on the receiving floor of the Nexus to witness the execution of my life's work. I had run this simulation in my mind 1,000 times during the stress tests of the original architecture, envisioning every possible way human error could destroy mechanical perfection. When Jagger entered the override command into the administrative console, wiping away the safety protocols with a single keystroke, he didn't just turn off a warning light or silence a troublesome buzzer. He effectively severed the neural connection between the robot's brain and its hands, performing a digital lobotomy on a machine capable of exerting 10 tons of crushing force. The system, now blinded, deafened, and stripped of its tactile feedback loops, reverted to a state of pure, unthinking mechanical execution. It simply followed the last instruction it was given by the scheduling algorithm. Pick up the load from the intake belt and insert it into slot B42 on the high bay racking system. It sounds simple. It sounds like a task a child could perform with a toy block. But in the world of automated heavy logistics, simplicity is a fragile illusion maintained by a million lines of defensive code, and Jagger had just deleted the defense. The robotic arm, known technically as Unit 4, was a massive construct of orange industrial steel and high-pressure hydraulic pistons, a machine I had personally calibrated to move with the elegance of a surgeon and the raw power of a locomotive. It swung down toward the conveyor belt with a terrifying obedience, unaware that it was about to commit suicide. The laser sensors on its wrist, which would normally scan the pallet's geometry for irregularities to ensure a perfect fit, were dark. They had been silenced by the master access key. The hydraulic grippers clamped onto the sides of the EcoWood pallet. The wood, swollen with Pacific Northwest rain, was now 4 millimeters wider than the manufacturing specification. Under normal protocols, the pressure sensors in the grippers would have detected this unexpected resistance within a millisecond and halted the operation to prevent damage. But under the override command, the feedback loop was ignored. The motors simply whined louder, drawing more current, applying more pressure, until the steel teeth bit deep into the soft, wet timber, creating a grip that would not let go. The arm lifted the heavy load, accelerating to 3 meters per second, swinging it toward the 40-foot-high steel racking system that lined the warehouse like the walls of a man-made canyon. It reached slot B42. This was the moment of impact, the inevitable collision between mathematical precision and physical reality. The steel racking in the Nexus is precision-engineered with a spatial tolerance of exactly 10 millimeters on either side. It is a tight fit designed to maximize storage density and efficiency. The swollen pallet, distorted by moisture and heavy with water weight, did not fit. A human operator would have seen this immediately. A human operator would have stopped, adjusted the angle, or rejected the load entirely. But the robot, stripped of its sensory feedback, did not know the load didn't fit. It only knew that its coordinate system said push. So, it pushed. The hydraulic rams engaged, delivering thousands of pounds of horizontal force. The wet wood of the pallet caught on the lip of the steel rack. It didn't slide in. It wedged. In a quiet warehouse, the sound of a robotic jam is not a dull thud. It is a scream. It is the sound of metal shearing against metal, a high-pitched, harmonic shriek that vibrates in your teeth and settles in your bones. The robot, sensing resistance but ordered to ignore it, pushed harder, trying to reach its programmed extension depth. The pallet, unable to withstand the compression, disintegrated. The cheap, sodden wood exploded under the pressure, sending splinters the size of daggers flying into the adjacent machinery. But the robot didn't stop there. With the resistance suddenly gone as the wood shattered, the arm lunged forward, its momentum carrying it straight into the vertical support beam of the racking structure. There was a sickening crunch, the sound of expensive machinery breaking its own bones. The impact bent the structural steel of the rack, sending a tremor through the entire aisle. A hydraulic line on the arm ruptured, spraying hot, pressurized fluid across the concrete floor like arterial blood. Then, and only then, did the laws of physics bring the motion to a halt. But it wasn't just one robot. The Nexus is a networked ecosystem, a hive mind where every action ripples through the whole. When Arm 4 impacted the structure, the vibration triggered the seismic sensors on Arm 5, Arm 6, and the overhead gantry crane. The central computer, realizing that a catastrophic physical collision had occurred, did exactly what I had programmed it to do in the event of a critical failure. It didn't just stop the broken arm. It initiated a hard lock. This is the nuclear option of safety protocols, a feature I designed to save the building from burning down. It instantly kills the power to every motor, every belt, every sorter, and every sensor in the entire 50,000 square foot facility to prevent a cascade of destruction. Imagine a busy highway where every car instantly slams on the brakes at the exact same second. The hum of the conveyors died instantly. The hiss of the pneumatics vanished. The rhythmic clanking of the sorters stopped. The warehouse, usually a cacophony of industrial productivity, was plunged into a tomb-like silence. The only sound remaining was the echo of the crash, the dripping of hydraulic fluid, and the settling of dust. In the control room, the screens didn't just flash red, they locked. Jagger, standing there with the master access key still in his hand, his heart likely hammering against his ribs, would have tried to reset it. He would have frantically tapped the clear error button. He would have tried to run the startup sequence. He would have screamed at the junior engineers to reboot the servers. But the screens would remain frozen, displaying a single, white dialog box against a stark black background. It was a message I had coded into the deepest layer of the kernel, a message that only appears when the physical integrity of the system has been compromised to a level that requires expert human intervention. It didn't ask for a password. It didn't ask for a reboot. The text read, "System integrity compromised. Hard lock engaged. Contact Chief Architect. Error code. Veta01. Jagger would have stared at my name glowing on the screen, a ghostly signature from the woman he had escorted out of the building. He would have realized, perhaps for the first time, that he hadn't just fired an employee, he had fired the only person who held the map to the labyrinth. He would have tried to bypass it, of course. Arrogance does not die easily. He would have called the IT technicians, the ones who knew how to reset a printer or configure a firewall. They would have typed their commands, tried their back doors, and realized that the hard lock wasn't a software bug, it was a physical quarantine. The system had barricaded itself from the inside to prevent the idiots in the control room from hurting it any further. I sat in my living room, watching the rain intensify against the window pane. I didn't need to see the screen to know what was happening. I could feel the stillness in the air, a disruption in the ether. I picked up my tea, the steam rising in the gray light of the afternoon. I took a sip. It was Earl Grey, hot and calming. I turned the page of the novel I had been trying to read for 3 days. I read the same paragraph twice, not because I was distracted, but because I was waiting. I was waiting for the realization to travel up the corporate ladder. Jagger would be terrified to call Caspian. He would spend the next hour trying to fix it himself, sweating through his cheap suit, making it worse, trying to pry open the digital doors that I had welded shut with logic. He would look at the destroyed robot arm, the shattered pallet, the leaking fluid, and he would know that his career was bleeding out on the floor alongside the hydraulic oil. While the inside of the warehouse was frozen in a dead, expensive silence, the outside world was beginning to collide with the reality of the failure. Logistics is a river. It flows continuously, day and night. You cannot simply build a dam without the water rising and flooding the banks. The trucks kept coming. They arrived from the manufacturing plants in the south, from the ports in the west, carrying electronics, perishable food, and high-value consumer goods. They arrived at the gate expecting to dock, unload, and leave within 45 minutes. That was the schedule I had perfected. That was the promise the Nexus made to its clients. Efficiency was our product, and we had just stopped producing it. But the gates were closed. The intake belts were motionless. The first truck, a long-haul driver who had driven 12 hours straight to make his delivery window, sat at the intercom, pressing the buzzer. No answer. The receiving clerks couldn't open the bay doors because the system was in hard lock. The safety protocols prevented the doors from opening if the internal machinery wasn't green-lit. It was a safety feature I had installed to prevent forklifts from driving off the edge of a dead dock into the dark. So, the truck waited. Then the second truck arrived. Then the third. Within 2 hours, the queue of 18-wheelers stretched from the intake gate, down the private access road, and began to spill out onto the public highway. These were not company drivers, these were independent contractors. They don't get paid by the hour, they get paid by the mile. Sitting still costs them money. The radio chatter among the drivers would have shifted from confusion to anger. Horns began to blare. A dissonant chorus of frustration rising over the sound of the rain. But the noise outside was nothing compared to the quiet disaster happening on the receiving dock itself. Before the system locked down, Jagger had forced the receiving crew to unload the first wave of deliveries manually to speed things up. In his desperation to prove his efficiency, he had ordered them to bypass the intake scan and simply offload the trucks. They had pulled nearly 200 pallets of electronics and dry goods out of the trailers and staged them on the open tarmac, expecting the robots to whisk them inside within minutes. But the robots never came. The robots were dead. And the pallets were still sitting there, stranded in the storm. The rain in the Pacific Northwest is not a gentle sprinkle. It is a cold, penetrating soak that seeks out every weakness. The staging area had a small overhang, but it was designed for transition, not storage. It wasn't deep enough to protect 200 pallets. The wind whipped the rain sideways, driving it into the stacks. I could picture it perfectly. The water pooling on the uneven concrete, creeping toward the bottom layers of the cardboard boxes. The cardboard, designed to be sturdy when dry, acts like a wick when wet. It draws the water up through capillary action. The structural integrity of the packaging begins to fail. The glue dissolves. The tape peels. The fiberboard turns to mush. Millions of dollars worth of inventory was sitting there, exposed to the elements. High-end gaming consoles, sensitive medical devices, designer clothing, all protected by nothing more than a layer of wet paper. As the boxes softened, the stacks began to lean. Gravity, relentless and patient, went to work. A stack of monitors, 5 boxes high, would tilt as the bottom box lost its shape. It would sway, and then it would topple, spilling its contents onto the wet asphalt. The sound of shattering glass and cracking plastic would be lost in the drumming of the rain, but the financial hemorrhage was very real. Every minute that passed was costing the company thousands of dollars in damaged goods, not to mention the penalties for delayed shipments and the loss of trust from clients who expected their cargo to be dry and secure. From his office on the 3rd floor, Caspian finally looked away from his spreadsheets and looked out the window. What he saw must have stopped his heart. He didn't see a strategic sourcing victory. He didn't see the cost savings he had promised the board. He saw a line of angry trucks extending to the horizon, their brake lights blurring in the mist. He saw his inventory dissolving in the rain. He saw the flashing lights of the Port Authority police arriving to manage the traffic jam his incompetence had created. He saw his bonus, his reputation, and his future washing away into the storm drains. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. The fat he had trimmed was the muscle that held the company upright. This was the moment the true panic set in. It wasn't the panic of a technical glitch. It was the panic of a captain realizing the ship has no rudder and the rocks are approaching fast. He would have turned to Jagger, his face drained of color, demanding answers. Jagger, pale and shaking, would have nothing to offer but the error code on the screen. Veda-01, the name of the woman they had discarded like trash, the name of the only person who could turn the lights back on. They would have called the legal department, asking if they could sue me. The lawyers, if they were competent, would have told them that firing the architect and then overriding her safety protocols constituted gross negligence on their part, not sabotage on mine. They were cornered. My phone, which I had placed face down on the coffee table, began to buzz. It was a vibrating hum against the wood, persistent and desperate. I didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. It wouldn't be Orla this time. Orla knew better. It would be a number from the executive suite. It would be Caspian, or perhaps his assistant, finally swallowing their pride because the water was rising past their necks. They were calling the firefighter after they had burned the house down. I let it ring. I watched the rain streak the glass, tracing the path of a single drop, as it merged with another and ran down to the sill. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. Then it started ringing again immediately. They were calling back. They were panicking. They were realizing that the silence of the warehouse was far more expensive than my salary had ever been. I picked up the teapot and poured another cup. The steam curled into the air, vanishing like their profits. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply letting the lesson sink in. In the world of systems architecture, you cannot fix a bug until you fully understand the extent of the error. They were still in the denial phase. They thought this was a negotiation. They thought they could call me, offer a tepid apology, and have me type a password over the phone to make the bad dream go away. They didn't understand yet that the bridge was burned, and I was the only one who knew how to swim. They didn't understand that the hard lock wasn't just a switch. It was a labyrinth of encryption that required a physical presence and a deep understanding of the system's topology to unravel. I let the phone ring for a third time, the sound merging with the rhythm of the storm outside. I had built the Nexus to be efficient, to be strong, to be resilient, but I had also built it to be just. And justice, it turns out, is a very cold, wet business. I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, while miles away, my replacement was watching $50 million turn into garbage. The first phase of their education was complete. Now, they would have to learn the price of tuition. I watched him adjust his cufflinks, the gold catching the harsh fluorescent light overhead, and I realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that he didn't see the machine. He didn't see the complexity. He only saw the receipt. I tried to interject, to explain the physics of the situation. I kept my voice low, controlled, the voice of the adult in the room. I explained that our robotic arms operated with a spatial tolerance of less than 1 millimeter. I explained that inertia is not a suggestion from a consultant. It is a fundamental law of nature. If we removed the calibration budget, the arms would eventually drift. A millimeter today becomes 2 millimeters next week. Eventually, steel collides with steel, and the illusion of efficiency shatters into a million expensive pieces. I spoke of torque, of load-bearing limits, of the delicate dance between software commands and hardware reality. Caspian didn't even blink. He didn't absorb a single word. He just smiled, that thin, empty smile that never reached his eyes. A smile that chilled me more than the air conditioning. He interrupted me to say he had found a new supplier for our shipping pallets, a vendor called Eco Wood Solutions, who could provide timber at nearly half the cost of our current contracts. He called it a strategic sourcing victory. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a physical reaction to the stupidity I was hearing. I knew Eco Wood. I knew their reputation in the logistics industry. They were the bottom of the barrel, the choice for fly-by-night companies that didn't care if their product arrived in 1 piece or 10. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the cold table to steady them, feeling the vibration of my own pulse. I told him, clearly and slowly, articulating every syllable, that cheap timber is hygroscopic. It drinks moisture from the air. I reminded him that we are located in the Pacific Northwest. Rain is not an event here. It is an environment. I explained that grade C wood acts like a sponge. When the humidity rises, it swells, it warps, it twists. Even a variance of 5 millimeters in the pallet dimensions would be rejected by the high-speed grippers I had programmed. If the wood was too thick, the robots would crush it. If it was too warped, the vacuum seals wouldn't hold, and they would drop heavy loads from 40 feet in the air. I painted a picture of absolute chaos, of shattered inventory, of halted lines, of safety sensors screaming in the dark. I gave him the forecast of a disaster that was mathematically guaranteed to happen. He waved his hand dismissively, cutting off my warning as if he were swatting away a fly. He picked up a heavy, gold-plated pen and signed the document in front of him, my termination paper. He told me that I was a relic. He said I was building a fortress when the market demanded a speedboat. He told me my role was being eliminated effective immediately because the company needed visionaries, not mechanics who were afraid of risk. He didn't ask for a transition plan. He didn't ask for the passwords to the subroutines or the logic maps I kept in my head. He just pointed to the glass door. I stood up. My knees popped, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. I felt a strange, detached sense of calm. It was the calm of a demolition expert who sees the fuse has been lit and knows there is nothing left to do but clear the blast zone. I didn't beg. I didn't scream. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I picked up my worn leather notebook, the one containing 10 years of system observations, and walked out, leaving him alone with his arrogance and his pen. The walk back to my desk felt like moving underwater. The air in the open-plan office seemed thicker, viscous, harder to breathe. The hum of the servers, a sound that usually comforted me like white noise, now sounded like a dying pulse, a rhythm that was about to be interrupted. As I passed the rows of cubicles, the office went silent. It was a ripple effect. As I moved, conversations died, heads ducked behind monitors, eyes averted. In a corporate environment, a fired executive is a contagion. Nobody wants to be patient zero by making eye contact with the walking dead. They knew. The email hadn't gone out yet, but the energy had shifted. They could smell the blood in the water. I walked past the break room where I had celebrated birthdays, past the whiteboard still covered in my architectural diagrams, complex flowcharts of logic and efficiency, knowing that by tomorrow, someone would have wiped it clean. My legacy was being erased in real time, scrubbed away by a dry erase marker. Waiting for me at my desk was Jagger, the new operations manager Caspian had brought along from his previous firm. Jagger was young, sharp-angled, and radiated the dangerous confidence of someone who has read the manual but never touched the machine. He was wearing a suit that was too tight and shoes that were too shiny for a warehouse floor. He was leaning against my desk, chewing on a plastic coffee stirrer, watching me with a look of amused pity. He was there to ensure I didn't steal company property, as if I could fit the proprietary algorithms I wrote into my handbag. He looked at me like I was an intruder in my own home. "Tough break, Veda," he said, the words hollow and insincere, tasting of false sympathy. "Caspian wants the hardware. Badge and key. Now." He held out his hand for my badge and the master access key. The key was a heavy black fob, dense and unremarkably ugly, but it held the digital keys to the kingdom. It was the only physical device capable of overriding the hard-coded safety limits of the entire facility. It was the nuclear option, designed for catastrophes, and I was about to hand it to a child who thought he was playing a video game. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing against the cool metal of the fob. I hesitated. For a split second, I considered keeping it. I considered refusing. I considered trying to save them from themselves one last time. But that wasn't my job anymore. The contract was broken. I pulled it out. Before I handed it over, I grabbed a yellow sticky note and a thick black marker from my drawer. My hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the inevitable collision I could see coming. I wrote a single, crucial instruction in bold, jagged ink. "Warning. Do not disable the weight sensor on Gate 4. It is the only failsafe for the vertical limit." I peeled the note off the pad and stuck it directly onto the main control monitor, right at eye level, covering the throughput graph Jagger loved so much. It was a beacon, a final act of professional courtesy, a lighthouse warning ships away from the rocks. Jagger looked at the note. He read it. Then he looked at me, and he laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh that grated against my nerves. He didn't throw it away. That would have been too dramatic. Instead, he did something worse. He peeled the note off the screen and used the sticky side to pick up some lint from his suit jacket. Then, he stuck it carelessly onto the side of a filing cabinet, upside down. It was a gesture of absolute dismissal. He was telling me that my warnings were trash. "We won't need training wheels where we're going, Veda," he said, stepping into my personal space to snatch the fob from my hand. "We're going to run the system on override mode. Maximize velocity. Push the limits. You were always too cautious." I stared at the yellow note, hanging upside down, ignored. It contained the difference between a functioning warehouse and a pile of scrap metal. But I said nothing. I placed the black fob on the desk, right next to the empty space where my daughter's picture used to be. I picked up my personal box, a cactus that had survived 5 years of fluorescent light, a chipped coffee mug, and a framed certificate of excellence that now felt like a joke. I walked toward the elevators. The metal doors slid shut, cutting off my view of the command center, severing the umbilical cord that had connected me to this building for a decade. The last thing I saw was Jagger spinning the master access key on his finger, oblivious to the fact that he was holding a live grenade. As I walked through the lobby, the automatic doors hissed open, and the humid gray air of the city hit me. It was raining. Of course, it was raining. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, dumping water onto the concrete. I walked to my car, a sensible sedan parked in the spot that still had my name stenciled on the pavement. I put the box in the passenger seat and sat there for a long time, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof. It was a soothing, chaotic sound. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was an automated notification from the receiving dock system, a script I had written years ago to track vendor compliance. The screen lit up with a message that sealed their fate. Shipment received. Vendor: Eco Wood Solutions. Quantity: 5,000 units. Status: uncovered. I looked up at the sky through the rain-slicked windshield. The rain was intensifying, a relentless downpour. Those pallets, made of cheap, thirsty wood, were sitting on the open dock. They were drinking. They were swelling. The cellular structure of the wood was expanding, absorbing the atmospheric moisture, changing its dimensions by fractions of a millimeter. The disaster had already begun. It just hadn't made a noise yet. I started the car and drove away, leaving the Nexus behind in the rearview mirror, a gray monolith waiting to fall. 3 days later, the silence of my house felt loud. It was a Tuesday, typically my busiest day, the day of the weekly optimization review. But now I was sitting on my sofa in a bathrobe, staring at the rain streaking the window pane. I had spent 72 hours decompressing, trying to untangle my brain from the logic loops of the warehouse. It is a strange sensation, the phantom limb of a career. I found myself waking up at 5 a.m., reaching for a phone that no longer received alerts. I found myself worrying about the server temperature before remembering it wasn't my server anymore. The rain hadn't stopped. It had been raining for 72 hours straight, a relentless Pacific Northwest deluge that turned the gutters into rivers. My severance package was substantial, enough to keep me comfortable for a year. But money couldn't turn off the architect's brain. I hadn't heard a word from the company. No panicked calls. No legal threats. For a brief, terrifying moment, I wondered if I was wrong. Maybe Caspian was right. Maybe the system could handle the abuse. Maybe I really was obsolete. The doubt is a terrible thing. It eats at you faster than anger. Then my phone vibrated on the coffee table. The sound made me jump, shattering the quiet of the room. It wasn't a call. It was a text. The name on the screen was Orla. Orla was my shift lead, a 55-year-old veteran with hands calloused from labor and eyes that missed nothing. She was the human soul of the machine floor, the only one who respected the robots as much as I did. Her message was short, stripped of any pleasantries, typed in a hurry. Robot Arm 4 is throwing a critical error. Unrecoverable misalignment. The new pallets are wet. I read the text, and I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was happening. Exactly as I had predicted. The humidity had seeped into the cellular structure of the grade C timber. The wood had swollen, expanding by perhaps 3, maybe 4 millimeters. To a human eye, it was invisible. To the laser sensors on the robotic grippers, it was a mountain. The system was doing exactly what I had designed it to do. It was rejecting the anomaly to protect the structure. I could see the control room in my mind's eye. The screens would be flashing amber alerts. The throughput numbers, the holy grail for men like Caspian, would be dropping toward zero, and Jagger would be pacing, sweating, looking at the screens and seeing only failure. He wouldn't see safety, he would see a bottleneck. I picked up the phone to reply. I wanted to tell her to stop the line. I wanted to tell her to get a moisture meter and prove the variance. But before I could type a single letter, a second text arrived from Orla. This one was different. It wasn't an update. It was a plea. Jagger just took the master key out. He's screaming at the engineers. He says the sensors are glitching. He is ordering a forced system override. I slowly lowered the phone. An override. The word echoed in my quiet living room. They weren't just ignoring the warning. They were silencing it. By using the master key to bypass the alignment check, Jagger was effectively blinding the robot. He was telling a machine with 10 tons of crushing force to close its eyes and push. He was forcing a square peg into a round hole, but the peg was made of swollen wood, and the hole was precision-milled steel. I stood up and walked to the window. I didn't need to be there to know what came next. Physics is a cruel mistress, and she was about to collect her debt. The collapse wasn't a possibility anymore. It was happening right now. I could imagine the hydraulics whining, the metal groaning under the strain, the sound of wood splintering as the robot tried to force the impossible. I turned off my phone. There was nothing more to say. The rain continued to fall, washing away their arrogance, drop by expensive drop. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it is simply the quiet sound of a phone ringing unanswered in an empty room. I didn't destroy the nexus, I just stopped holding it up and let gravity do the rest. Silence isn't weakness. In the corporate world, it is the most expensive weapon you own. If you have ever had to walk away from a place that didn't value you, just to prove your worth, remember, you are not alone. If this spoke to you, like, comment, and share it with someone who's still finding their own voice.